Okay, now I'd like to introduce Indy Tansey. She's going to moderate our panel. Hey. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm here today to introduce our incredible panel, if they're out here, and I guess ask a few questions. I'm Indy from outtrippin.com, check us out. We're a cool new travel startup, and last year we got the chance to go to San Francisco and New York to check out the startup scene there. And it was an incredible experience, blew our minds, probably raised more questions than answers, which is really good because we have some really great people to answer some questions tonight. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Lenny Mayo. Now, unless you've been hiding under a rock, you'll know Lenny is the founder of one of Australia's biggest tech startup global success stories, 99 Designs. He's also the director of Flipper, the co-founder of Learnable, and he's been investing and giving back to the local scene since 2000. And he's going to be talking about the Melbourne ecosystem tonight. Next up, we've got Susan Wu. Now, she wears more hats than she has heads. She's a hacker, an entrepreneur, a venture capitalist. She splits her time between San Francisco and Australia, but we're trying to keep her here a bit more now. As an angel investor and an advisor, she's been involved in a few startups you might have heard of. Twitter, Square, Medium. She's done a few good things. She's going to be sharing her knowledge and insights about the Silicon Valley scene with us tonight. So, Susan, thank you. And finally, we've got Brendan Lewis. Now, he's been working in growth and innovation across the globe for a quarter of a century. So as you can imagine, I can't quite squish his resume into 15 seconds. He's founded businesses in Australia, Hong Kong, Romania, Vietnam. He's the Melbourne rep for London and Partners, the official promotional organisation for London, and it's designed to attract and deliver value for businesses. And he'll be answering questions for the London ecosystem. Ecosystems are popping up all over the world, and the Genome Report of ecosystems, of course, Silicon Valley was at number 1, London came in at number 7, and Melbourne came in at 18. In your opinion, what are the key factors of a strong startup ecosystem?
This is going to sound funny, but the key factors of a strong, successful ecosystem are a bunch of successful startups. It's as simple as that. So I think that the kind of science and the methodology around this is really kind of weak, and that generally people look for success, and success is, kind of more or less readily visible. So it's kind of difficult to, people are kind of navel gazing when they're looking for successful ecosystems. Someone famously said it's difficult to, make predictions, especially about the future. And so this is this ecosystem thing. So people just look for success. Yeah.
Cool.
Thanks, Lenny. I agree. Where successful ecosystems get promoted because of the successful members of it, not because of what anything's done. But in terms of what London's doing, which is very much trying to, they're executing a plan around creating and building a much bigger successful ecosystem. It's very much, the focus is very much about connectivity. It's not about supporting, picking winners and supporting them. It's actually about making sure the governments, the universities, private enterprise, the startups, they're all really connected. And the kind of concept is that there's rather than picking winners, there's room at the finish line for everyone.
Oh, before I answer, I just want to confess that I would love to see a more conversational type of back and forth here. So if there's a way that we could make this more of a dialogue, that'd be awesome. So I totally agree with Lenny. I think success begets success. So what happens is when you have successful startups in the ecosystem, people leave those startups, whether they're engineers and product managers, and then they go start new startups or they become investors themselves, lending their wisdom back into the community, which is why I think Lenny is spending so much time devoting his time to the community to give back to help foster some of that knowledge in the system. And then I've just been really impressed actually with what's happened in London. So if you look at London, probably about 5 years ago, the scene was relatively moribund. And due to a lot of governmental intervention and effort, the scene has become very lively and rich with venture capital investment and rich with flourishing startups. I think it's pretty interesting. I don't know what that bodes for Melbourne's ecosystem. Maybe that's a future question.
Yeah, based on that, I guess if you could maybe elaborate, especially Brendan, in the London scene, what are some of the initiatives and some of the driving forces that the government has helped drive and support the developing ecosystem?
So in London, the major focus of the startup scene is around an area called Shoreditch that's been relabelled by the government as Tech City. A number of years ago, Shoreditch was jokingly called Silicon Roundabout. There was about 300 firms in there. And the government, though, to their credit, recognised there was something going on. They slapped the label of Tech City on it, and they started to put energy into it. And the energy came in a variety of different forms. The Open Data Institute was put into there. The Future City Centre was put into there. At a national level, there's programs that support entrepreneurs in terms of tax relief for investors, tax relief for entrepreneurs in terms of share structuring and capital gains. There's some fairly attractive intellectual property laws that they put in place, and what they've done is, so in that environment now, just to put it in context, London is, depending on where you want to draw the boundaries, it's 2 to 3 times the size of Melbourne, so 8 million people or 13 million people if you talk about commute. Melbourne has 8 universities, London has 45. London has 500,000 people working in the IT industry. Melbourne has in the vicinity of I think it was about 50,000 from what I figured out. So London's 3 times the size, but has a vastly bigger hitting power. It has 22,000 IT firms in there. So in that environment, you've gone from Tech City having about 300 startups to now there's about 3,000 in the Shoreditch area. There's 22 venture capitalists, and there is a vast number of activity around networks that have been supported by the government. Also, there's been a very strong focus into the large US players saying that your European head office will be in London. It won't be in Manchester, it won't be in Paris, it won't be in Frankfurt. Frankfurt's the main competitor. Well, it won't be in Dublin.
It'll be in Dublin.
Well, Dublin, but the problem with Dublin is it's just people go there for tax advantages, and when the tax advantage dries up, they tend to leave.
I find that to be a little bit exaggerated. I think there's a relatively strong engineering population there that draws a lot of companies to set up headquarters there.
So, but in London you have a Google campus in Shoreditch. You have Microsoft BizSpark program there. You have in the travel community, you have people like Airbnb who have Expedia. They're setting up in London, and London has a very heavy focus on doing that. London's also the one that they're currently doing deals with San Francisco and New York to make sure that they have this partnership of 3 that can sustain them all. That this is where, if you're an American company going to Europe, you choose London through that partnership.
Well, I don't know that it's an either-or decision, so I am not certain that I'm on another side of the debate here, but I'm just saying that Dublin is actually a really great, viable place for a startup to set up shop, in addition to London.
Oh, and Frankfurt's a great place to set up too. There's lots of great places, but in terms of the London community, they're very focused on building something there that's sustainable. The general position of the UK is that they're responsible for the Industrial Revolution, and they fucked it up because it's dirty and it's bad. So let's become a greener city, and let's become digital and environmental friendly is part of the 2 major themes that are going on.
You touched on the engineering. I mean, every ecosystem needs a workforce. I guess geographically placed, Melbourne is a long way from Silicon Valley and London. Lenny, in your experience, what do you think Melbourne can do to help attract the best people and the most committed?
In a conversation I had with Susan earlier, I'd be interested to hear her kind of observations around the commitment of startups here in Melbourne, because it's kind of difficult to look at the stuff that you see every day with fresh eyes, but just in terms of kind of education, which fits into a broader context. So I don't know, I was kind of invited to speak tonight. I actually looked up the definition of the word ecosystem, and it's about the interaction of kind of living organisms with their environment, which typically means kind of like the non-living environment. And so so then that raises the question, like, what is the environment? And one of the things in our environment is culture. And there's education and, you know, government, infrastructure, a whole bunch of stuff. But so education and culture. And yes, we are a long way away, but one of the things that comes with that is, and let me see if I can invite a little bit of conflict here. When the average American was asked, what do you think of the problems in Central America? They thought they were talking about the Midwest. So while it's not necessarily true of San Francisco, you know, the sort of average American might say that there's so much going on in our country that perhaps we don't need to look at what's going on in the rest of the world. Whereas here in Australia, we have a fairly clear handle that we're a pretty small player, and so I think a lot of Australians tend to look outside our shores. And a friend of mine wrote a story about the maritime history of Australia, and she told me that around the turn of the 20th century, Australian was one of the largest maritime ports in the world, and Australia had a culture that was very much like the Dutch. We were like a seafaring, trading, outward-looking people, and then along came mass media, and because the maritime game was pretty hard yakka, it was heavily unionised, and mass media didn't want to hold up heavily unionised workforce in their marketing materials, so they went for independent man on the land, kind of the rural, extractive, exploitative kind of images of Australia. But nevertheless, in our history, there's a strong outward-looking kind of thing, and many of the successful startups you see, at least in Melbourne, have that kind of strong outward-looking kind of piece to it. Just on education, you know, it's Australia's largest services export. There's some good things and bad things. Maybe that's a topic for a different conversation. Yeah.
I'm good. I'm good. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. You want me to answer your question?
Yeah.
Oh, so I moved to Melbourne about a month ago. I've permanently relocated here, and so I've spent a lot of time in the last month talking to different startup founders and people here building the ecosystem. And what I've noticed is that though the ecosystem is less mature and probably less robust in various ways, which we might be able to talk about, that the people are really interesting and fascinating in the sense that they're not, you know, you guys are not less talented and less creative and less full of possibility than Silicon Valley and entrepreneurs at all. And I think, if anything, Australians and the people I've met in Melbourne in particular are unusually committed to the startups that they're building, right? Because of a lack of capital, because of a lack of investor infrastructure, when you decide to start a startup here, you're unusually committed and unusually passionate about it. I think that's a strength. And so if I were to think about building the Australia startup ecosystem, I would take a look at the assets that we have here, which are incredibly talented, smart, educated people who are unusually self-selecting to be passionate and extra committed to their startups compared to the usual Silicon Valley founder who can basically fail into a six-figure job at Google or Facebook if they fail, which you don't have the option of here in Australia. And I would think about the kinds of industries that you can really dominate by building a startup here, and what are the kinds of user behaviors or kinds of sales channels that are particularly appropriate for the kinds of products that would succeed here. So that's how I would think about building the startup ecosystem here. Not, you know, how do we replicate what Silicon Valley is doing, but how do we take our unique assets and strengths and turn them to our advantage.
I might usurp Indy's role here and ask a follow-up question to Susan. Can you elaborate more on your thoughts around the robustness issue?
Can you ask a more specific question?
Well, I just think it's a really, when you travel and you come to a new place, you look at things with fresh eyes. And you've been in Australia for some time, but you're sort of closer to the fresh eyes thing than I am and many people here. So, some of the areas where particularly, like you mentioned, kind of you felt that it's not necessarily as robust as other places.
You basically didn't provide any more specificity, but I will answer the question anyway. Yes. I guess what I mean by robustness is, first of all, there's a lack of investor base here, right? There's not much true risk capital. A lot of the investors here seem to be pretty interested in investing in particular revenue goals. I'm the opposite kind of investor, and historically I've always been interested in investing in startups that are changing user behaviors on a large scale and not necessarily focused on immediate revenue generation. So there's kind of a lack of community around that kind of risk capital. And then also just with startup founders, there are just not that many startup founders here who have been through it multiple times, seen multiple stages of failure. Like, for example, I personally have seen and have many friends who have seen startups at every stage, from being bootstrapped to to going public, to post-IPO, to being acquired after being public. And sort of, when you walk down the street in Noe Valley and go to the local coffee shop, you'll probably run into like 6 people who have all gone through that process in the last month, right? So that kind of robustness doesn't exist. And so I think what Lenny was sort of hinting at earlier is that, and also what Brendan was alluding to with what London has done with the tech city, is that we need to create that density ourselves, which can be a geographic type of density, but it can also be more of a dialogue type of density, right? These kinds of events that we have here, how do we accelerate the learnings from this conversation? How do we spread what we've learned from our failures as well as our successes? How do we actually give people insight into the nuances of failure and success, not just talk about them generally like lean startups are great? Well, that's great, but that doesn't really help me understand how to apply those principles on a daily basis, right? So somehow we need to accelerate that momentum to facilitate more robustness. Does that answer your question?
I'd also just mention that I think people like Lenny are quite actually rare, that people who've had some wins and then sharing the lessons. There's an awful lot of successful digital people in Melbourne who have started up to exited brilliantly, who are just silent, and you don't see them. They're all over the place. There's a lot of people who have done fantastic businesses. They don't appear at Lean Startup Melbourne. They don't appear. They don't talk. They don't share their lessons. Because we don't seem to have that culture.
How do we get them to?
That's a great question. Well, so Brendan's alluding to, all of the people that have made money, Seek, real estate, car sales, PC tools, Hitwise, multi-$100 million exits, and all the people that kind of, made out like bandits is not a very flattering expression, but they did reasonably well, and they had a bunch of experience that could be shared, and those people are not here and don't kind of aren't involved. This kind of ecosystem thing, those people are around. They just don't. I don't know. Like there's kind of different parts of the ecosystem is this kind of multifaceted thing, and
but they all know each other. They engage.
So here's a rule from throwing parties, which also applies to starting communities, which is all you need is to get 2 people dancing, and then you get more people dancing, right? So I think all we need to do is get 2 or 3 people building momentum around themselves. So Lenny, do you want to start dancing for us?
If I start dancing, I'm pretty sure there won't be a second one.
This is probably a good time to put it out to the crowd. If anyone has any questions for any of our panel, maybe raise a hand. And
my viewing of the ecosystem is that you've already got Commercialisation Australia, and they're supporting a lot of the technological, IT, new products, new services. And you guys haven't mentioned that. Also, there's a small business mentoring service, which is a government subsidised system, and I'm one of the business mentors. I do startups. And also you've got the Swinburne crowd, who are doing a lot of startups as well. And also you've got the stockbrokers, who are also promoting IPOs and startups in the pharmacy and high-tech areas. So I think that the ecosystem is bigger than what you guys make it out to be.
I think that, and I was just sort of reminded of that metaphor of the sort of image of Australia got used in mass media for many decades of, like, you know, man on the land, basically, you know, kind of person farming, you know, battling Mother Nature to produce crops and then, you know, feeding a family. That image, like, a lot of people, you know, if you look at the 90s and for most of the 2000s, kind of people in successful enterprises didn't have any support, didn't involve themselves in community, didn't get any help, didn't participate. And so those people have not got any sort of connection or whatever. They're sort of broadly, yeah, it's good that something's happening, but, you know, not really interested in that aspect of it. So, so maybe that's a reason. They just, and you often kind of see that even with, you know, I'm a bit of an exception, but the SitePoint Group and Envato and, you know, the Redbubble crew, and you can look at a whole bunch of successful things kind of happening in Melbourne. And those people just, they're on their own trip and they don't come to things like this. And, you know, maybe all you people shouldn't be here either, just doing stuff.
Invited. I mean, people like that like to be invited. And I wonder if they're actually invited to speak.
Hi guys, my name is Philip. I'm the co-founder of Blue Dot Innovation. I'm just going to touch on what was said previously. Commercialisation Australia is here. I don't know if anyone's actually filed an application, 60,000 words. Took us about 5 months to get through it. Terrible experience. For stockbrokers, yes, they're there. Generally for capital raising, about 14% they ask in Australia, which is just an absolute terrible figure. The truth is that in Australia, at the end of the day, you have to have people who are going to invest, who are going to believe in your product and who obviously expect to see a return out of it. The truth is that you can get an angel round at the beginning in Australia. It's not that difficult. We managed to do it. What the problem is that now we're going for a second stage. The second stage involves VCs, involves a much smaller pool of sources of funding, and involves much stricter rules. So one of the questions that I'd like to pose, particularly to Susan, is if you could tell us, in terms of VCs and larger investment organisations, what are the main differences that you've seen between the US and in Australia in terms of valuation, in terms of requirements, in terms of due diligence? Thanks.
So to be honest, I haven't actually seen enough term sheets and I haven't seen enough deals yet. So I can't totally answer that. Perhaps check back with me in a month or 2 months when I've had more time to visit with VCs here and actually understand what the deal process looks like. I can only speak anecdotally and I don't want to give anecdotal examples to such an important question.
Maybe the other guys, just some impressions of VCs?
One of the things that I've been aware of, one of the other hats I wear is I chair the Churchill Club and have for the last 8.5 years. And quite clearly in Melbourne there's an imbalance of knowledge around how to do these transactions. So there's an imbalance then in negotiating where the venture capitalists and corporate advisors hold the majority of the power. And what happens is there's this steady churn of entrepreneurs, bright young things who actually don't have much capability in that area and get burnt and eventually pull away from it, which is why one of the reasons why we get that entrepreneurial churn.
So the VCs have a club in Australia. It's called AVCAL, the Australian Venture Capital Association, and you know they honestly look at how their members do every year and they publish it in a report. And for the last 13 years in a row, venture capital in Australia has lost money. So, you know, if in, you know, your company plan you have like, I must raise venture capital from Australian venture capital investors unless I'm sunk, then that's a very high risk plan.
Do we have any more questions? Yeah? Yeah, come forward if you don't mind.
When I organised the Startup Walkabout in October, I would have to say all of the people that I rang, and I did call, Envato, Zendesk, and also Redbubble, and they were all absolutely keen to get involved, and they all opened their doors and they all got involved. So even though they're not here, they're absolutely happy to help. So if you've got someone that you look up, just call. They'll almost certainly take your call, and they'll almost certainly make time for coffee.
Hi there. I just moved here from Pittsburgh in the States, where I was working in a battery manufacturing startup, which I helped take from 3 to 120 people and to a product that's almost on the market. Moved here for other reasons. One of the things that I notice about startups in, you think about Silicon Valley or you think about, around Boston, is that it's not just software. There's a lot of manufacturing, there's a lot of hardware startups, and I've been to quite a few of these events, and it's very, very software focused. And I think that the interplay between software, between hardware, between biomed is something that is possibly missing here, and I wonder if the panel would like to comment on that a little bit.
I'll go last.
Thank you for that. I think that probably what you see is a selection bias. There's a lot of activity in biomedical startups, there's a lot of activity in hardware startups. They're just not part of this circle. So if you move to places like out to Knox, you'll have people like CEMEP, the Southeastern Metropolitan Innovation Precinct, where there's large numbers of nanotech companies, there's large numbers of biomedical companies, instrumentation companies, lots going on out there. They don't engage in any of the discussions around lean startup. They have their own different set of discussions, which are around IP management. So there are lots of people in Melbourne, you're just not seeing them because they don't tend to move in this circle.
Brendan, to my right here, is the founder of something called churchillclub.org.au, and for the last 5, 6, 7 years, Brendan's been holding kind of monthly events on a kind of very broad range of stuff, and his events do cover all kinds of, gyrocopters delivering goods to your front door, and more than just kind of software and web. So, so just, if you're interested in that stuff, keep an eye on that. There's a pretty broad menu.
Actually, now that I remember, one of the very first emails I sent Lenny after I moved here was, where are the 3D printing startups? I think there's definitely a few categories of startups that I think are well suited for success in Australia. So 3D printing would be one of them. Big data startups around agriculture is another one that I think could do pretty well here. So there's definitely all kinds of categories that don't fit into the normal consumer enterprise software categories. And then to your question, Philip, about venture capital, I think the one difference I have noticed, because I've been mentoring various startups at Angel Cube and StartMate and so on and so forth, is that I think the expectations that people have as to what it takes to raise venture funding in Silicon Valley are probably not as accurate as they should be, and maybe that's part of what I can do here in the ecosystem is help startups who want to raise funding outside of Australia understand what those metrics are that they need to be focused on, and how the investors in different places look for entirely different kinds of measures of success than they do here. So for example, things like engagement by user, if this is a software company, the kinds of things that they'd be interested in would be like engagement, time spent, number of times your particular app or software program was opened or used or interacted with, per day. Is that number increasing? Which are obviously very different kinds of questions than the investors here ask.
If I can just kind of talk to something that's come up a couple of times, even though it's not directly relevant to that question. One of the things that we haven't spoken about, but sort of alluded to a couple of times, is, there's been a bunch of people who've come to Melbourne for non-professional reasons, and yet they're kind of incredibly sort of qualified or experienced in some area or another. And, I'm involved with the SitePoint group, and we regularly hire people who are super duper and get fantastic jobs in the city in which they live, but they're just looking for something different. They're looking for a lifestyle thing. I think what they do is they go to the wiki Wikipedia page is like the world's most livable city, and look at the top one and go Melbourne, and then they just go, how do I find a job in Melbourne? And I think I'm just about to hand over to Brendan, but I think this is kind of something that characterises our ecosystem. And I remember if Tom's here, Tom and I had a robust debate on Twitter last year. Tom went through Y Combinator and expressed a desire that Australian startups be more ambitious. And my kind of response to that was, our ambition lies in, like having a lifestyle and also doing something that makes a difference in the world. And I think this is something that, I'd like to see kind of more conversation about, is like, what does that mean? How does that play out in practice? Because I think it's something that sort of characterises us. There's not that many number one most livable cities on the planet. In fact, there's only one. So what does that mean? Like, yeah.
Thanks, Lenny. And you're right. One of the questions I ask people is, Melbourne has the world's most livable city, but is it the best place to grow $1 billion startup? Do we have the right ecosystem? But I was just going to mention on people, one of the things that I've noticed over the last couple of years, in Melbourne there's some fantastic talent that's hidden, and the driver of it is that there's people doing really interesting things globally that marry Melbourne women, and they have a great time, and then they have children, and their wife says to them, and I've seen this a number of times, the wife says to them, I want the kids to grow up in Melbourne because it's the world's most livable city. So the global creative director for Apple lives in Kensington, or the gig they used to have. The guy that was the global sales director for Nokia. And we do have this talent in Melbourne, but we just don't access it. And most of the time it's invisible.
So you're saying we should send out the women?
Yeah.
Bring back.
Yeah, send out Melbourne. Bring it back. So you can just speak.
Let that percolate.
We've probably got time for one more question. Maybe two quick ones.
Hi guys, just a quick question. I think the technology aspect needs to be looked at in terms of history. With America, early 80s, we talked about semiconductors, PCs. America really led the way with that. We were too busy with mining. Then we had a recession. 5 years later, nothing happened. Early 90s, we're talking about the first internet, things happening. More mining, nothing happened. 2000, tech boom all over the world. Here we had the Sydney Olympics, that's what the focus was on. Now we talk about mining is really, going in the crapper. We've got an opportunity to invest the 1 trillion that's in superannuation into things like technology. We're the 25th largest country by capita, but we're the 4th largest country by investor funds. So is there a way that we can access that money and get more people focused on technology?
First of all, the government doesn't give a rat's about startups in this country. They just don't care. The only reason they care about startups is because they care about the percolation of technology through the broader economy, because they think they've got some vague idea that technology improves productivity, and so they're happy to be supportive of things that accelerate the penetration of productivity into the broader economy. And so to the extent startups help accelerate the penetration of technology into the broader economy, they're the startups are a good thing. But startups as, things that change the world, or, businesses that employ people or make money, they couldn't care less. So let's just be realistic about the government. There was another point, but anyway, I forget.
I'd agree with you, Lenny, just with one proviso though. The government does see startup, they just see excitement around innovation, but as long as it comes out of a lab. As long as there's PhDs doing it, it's exciting. If it comes out of a garage, no one has any interest.
So I know nothing about the superannuation structure here in Australia, so actually I'm going to use this time to formulate a response to Brendan's previous comment about the unknown gem men out there, and actually say that, so I've had the privilege to be invited to speak at Scale Ventures tomorrow night, and for those of you who don't know, it was kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, but Scale Ventures is essentially an entire investor network of extremely successful entrepreneurial women in Australia. And I've been totally blown away by the quality of the investors and the founders in that network. And so that's all. they're great women in technology, and we should also try to support them.
Okay, final question at the back here.
Hi, Mark Bergen from the Mobile and App Design Awards. I can't help look at the narrative from this evening and think that the conversation's been about what we aren't. And I look out in the room and I see 400 odd inspired people who actually believe that they're doing something different. So I suppose, Lenny, if I think back to probably about 99 was when I first met you, and you were involved with an email startup. Do you remember that? I remember you were excited and you were telling me about it. If you look at where we are now versus 99, when you then headed into sausage, this is beautiful. This is, you know, the Babylon Gardens, isn't it? So if you were able to make a success in 99, then definitely everybody in the room can make it. It's probably a matter of actually co-supporting each other and actually then building the clout to get government to be involved.
Like all the community and the government, and it's all kind of nice to have. What really matters is like, you know, your customers and where you're going. So this is just, you know, it's kind of nice to have this. It's really good, but it's not the main game.
Susan?
Oh, and I just wanted to add that I want to contribute to what Lenny's already been building here, and I'm going to volunteer my time to do open office hours here at Inspire 9 as well.
Great.
I'm feeling a little bit of pressure. I'm happy for anyone to hit me up for some advice on growing their businesses internationally.
Great.
And every now and again, Susan and I are going to double team and like do our office hours together, like with the same people. So that's should be something interesting.
Great. Well, it's a great way to wrap it up with very kind offers from all three of you. Thank you for chairing the panel today, and yeah, thanks for everyone for participating.